A man screams as he's dragged across the floor, leaving streaks of blood behind him. Behind the desk, Du Sungdong doesn't even look up. Dispose of him. The room falls silent. Then, thud, a cleaning cart bumps into the desk. April Nakato freezes. She just walked into the worst possible room at the worst possible time. Sungdong finally looks up. His men reach for their guns. He tosses a blood-stained envelope at her feet. 200,000. Take it, and forget what you saw. April looks at the money. Then slowly, she kicks it back. The cash scatters across the floor. The entire room goes still. I'm a cleaner, she says. Not someone you can buy. And that was the moment everything changed. The flashes of the cameras were like a barrage of gunfire, blinding and relentless. April Nakato stood in the center of the storm, her hand gripped firmly by Du Sungdong. Just 20 minutes ago, she had been wearing a stained apron and holding a mop. Now, she was draped in a tailored silk blazer that smelled of expensive cedar and cold steel. The transition was so fast her head spun, but as she looked out at the sea of hungry reporters, her survival instincts took over. She didn't look like a terrified cleaner. She looked like a woman who held the secrets of the world behind her eyes. At the front of the ballroom sat Madame Du, Sungdong's grandmother and the matriarch of the Xinhua group. She was a woman whose smile was as sharp as a razor, and right now, she was glaring at April with a mixture of confusion and aristocratic disdain. Beside her sat this suitable bride, Min Chai-rin, the daughter of a rival conglomerate, looking like a porcelain doll whose world had just been shattered. The lead reporter from Seoul Daily stepped forward, his microphone thrust towards Sungdong like a weapon. Mr. Du, the rumors of your engagement to the Baek clan's daughter have been circulating for months. Who is this woman? We have no record of her in any social registry. Sungdong didn't flinch. His grip on April's hand tightened, his thumb grazing her knuckles in a way that was meant to look possessive to the cameras, but felt like a warning to her. The social registry is for people who want to be found. Sungdong's voice rang out, deep and authoritative. April isn't a debutante. She is the most brilliant tactical mind I have ever encountered. She has been my secret weapon for a long time. And as of today, she is my fiancée. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Madame Du stood up, her cane hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Sungdong, enough of this theater. You cannot expect us to believe that this girl is a match for the Xinhua heritage. April felt the sting of the insult, but before she could speak, Sungdong leaned closer to her. He didn't look at his grandmother. He looked only at April, his intense, hooded eyes searching hers. The red cinematic lighting of the hall cast long, dangerous shadows across his jawline. My grandmother believes in bloodlines, Sungdong whispered, loud enough for the front row mics to catch. I believe in results. He turned back to the crowd. Earlier today, our internal servers were hit by a Type 7 encryption bypass. My entire security team sat on their hands while our assets were bled dry. It was April who stopped the bleed. It was April who traced the source. If she can protect my empire in 20 seconds, imagine what she will do as the woman by my side. Chai-rin stood up, her face flushed with humiliation. This is a joke. She's a commoner. She's a nobody. Sungdong, you are doing this just to spite the arrangement. The reporters surged forward, the questions becoming a chaotic roar. They wanted a scandal. They wanted to see the cleaning girl break under the pressure. April felt the familiar heat of defiance rising in her chest. She looked at Madame Du, then at the cameras. She knew that if she faltered now, Sungdong would discard her as easily as he had discarded the man she saw him retire earlier that morning. I may not have a registry entry, April said, her voice cutting through the noise with a sudden, chilling clarity. But I have the decryption keys to every rival account that tried to touch Xinhua today. If you want to talk about status, let's talk about the fact that I am the only reason this company still has a bottom line. Sungdong's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected her to play the hand so aggressively. A dark, genuine smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He realized then that she wasn't just a shield. She was a partner who knew how to strike. To the media, it looked like a power move. To Sungdong, it was a confirmation. He needed to end the speculation once and for all. He needed to burn the bridge back to Chirin so thoroughly that no one would ever dare suggest a different marriage again. Without warning, he reached out, his hand cupping April's jaw. He pulled her toward him, his movement fluid and dominant. April's breath hitched. For a split second, she thought about pulling away, about the blood on the envelope, about the danger of the man holding her. But then she saw Madame Du's face turn pale with fury, and she realized that in this world, there was no middle ground. You were either the predator or the prey. Sungdong pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't the soft, romantic kiss of a storybook. It was a claim. It was hard, possessive, and tastes of expensive whiskey and cold ambition. The camera flashes became a solid wall of white light, capturing the image that would be on every front page in Asia by morning. The king of the underground, kissing the woman who had defied him. When he finally pulled back, he didn't let her go. He kept his arm hooked around her waist, pulling her flush against his suit. He looked directly at the camera lens, his eyes daring anyone to challenge him. "The wedding will be private," Sungdong announced, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Any further questions regarding my fiancé's background will be considered an act of hostility against the Xinhua group." He began to lead her off the stage, his pace brisk. The guards formed a human wall, pushing back the frantic reporters. As they reached the sanctuary of the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall, the silence of the corridor hit them like a physical weight. Sungdong let go of her waist immediately. The warmth disappeared, replaced by the clinical coldness he had shown in the office. He straightened his tie and looked at his watch. "You handled the press better than expected," he said, not looking at her. "But don't get comfortable. That kiss wasn't for you. It was for them." April wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes flashing. "Don't worry, Mr. Du. I know exactly what this is. You bought a brain, not a heart. But remember, if you use me as a shield, make sure you don't stand too close. Shields can be heavy enough to crush you." Sungdong paused, his hand on the handle of his private elevator. He looked back at her, his gaze lingering on her natural hair and the natural fire in her eyes. For the first time, he didn't see a cleaner or a coder. He saw a threat he actually enjoyed. "Get in the car, April," he said softly. "Our life together has just begun, and in my world, there are no resignations." The glass-walled boardroom of the Xinhua group felt less like an office and more like an aquarium where the sharks were starting to realize a human had just been dropped into their tank. April sat at the mahogany table, still feeling the phantom pressure of Sungdong's lips on hers from the press conference. She was no longer wearing the silk blazer. She had changed into a sharp, charcoal gray power suit that Sungdong's assistants had produced as if by magic. Across from her sat 6 men in bespoke tailoring, their faces a mask of barely suppressed rage. "Mr. Du," one of the senior directors began, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and indignation. "With all due respect, the merger with the Hanshin Group is a billion-dollar deal. It has been vetted by 3 separate legal firms and our entire internal auditing team. Bringing her into this high-level strategy session is a breach of every protocol we have." Sungdong sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled, his eyes fixed on a digital tablet. He didn't look up. Protocol didn't stop the Beck clan from nearly draining our alpha count this morning. April did. If you're worried about protocol, perhaps you should worry about why a cleaning girl found a hole in our security that your $100,000 a year analysts missed. The room went silent. The directors traded uneasy glances. Sungdong finally looked at April, his expression unreadable. "The Hanshin merger. They've sent over the final digital asset ledger for verification. Review it." A tablet was slid across the polished wood toward her. April didn't hesitate. She pulled the device toward her, her fingers flying across the screen. The directors watched her with sneers, waiting for her to trip over the complex financial jargon or the intricate coding of the smart contracts. They expected her to be a fraud, a puppet Sungdong was using to embarrass them. But April wasn't seeing numbers or names. She was seeing the architecture. To her, code was a language of intent, and right now, the Hanshin Group was shouting. "This merger isn't a partnership," April said suddenly. her voice cutting through the tension. It's a suicide pact. The lead auditor let out a dry, mocking laugh. Young lady, those are smart contracts. They are immutable. They ensure that Shinhwa gains 40% of Hanshin's logistics infrastructure upon signing. It's the biggest land grab in our history. It's a land grab, April countered, spinning the tablet around to show a string of nested loops hidden deep within the sublayers of the contract's execution code. But you're grabbing a minefield. Look at Section 8, subsection C. The auto-liquidation trigger. The auditor frowned, leaning in. That's a standard clause for debt restructuring. In plain English, yes, April said, her natural confidence beginning to burn through the nobody persona. But look at the timestamping logic. There's a Trojan horse script buried here. It's designed to ping an external server, one owned by a shell company in the Cayman Islands, exactly 72 hours after the merger is finalized. When that server pings back, it triggers an artificial default on Hanshin's debt. She tapped a specific line of code. Because of the way you've structured the merger, that default won't just hit Hanshin. It will create a cross-collateralization cascade. Shinhwa will be legally forced to cover Hanshin's ghost debts. By day 4 of this billion-dollar deal, you won't own 40% of their infrastructure. They will own 60% of yours. You're not buying a company. You're inviting a parasite to eat you from the inside out. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. The auditor's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. He grabbed the tablet, his hands shaking as he finally saw what April had spotted in minutes. Sungdong leaned back, his gaze shifting from the tablet to April. The red light of the afternoon sun hit the side of his face, emphasizing the sharp, angular line of his jaw. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. Who owns that Cayman shell company? Sungdong asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. April's fingers danced across the screen again, bypassing 3 layers of masked IP addresses. Tracking the routing now. It's bouncing through Singapore, then Zurich. Wait. She paused, her eyes narrowing. The registration for the server isn't Hanshin Group. It's a private entity registered under the name Black Tiger. The directors gasped. One of them actually dropped his pen. Black Tiger was the notorious financial wing of the Beck clan. They didn't just try to hack us this morning, April whispered, the weight of the realization hitting her. That hack was a distraction. They wanted us focused on our servers so we wouldn't look too closely at the merger paperwork. They wanted us to sign our own death warrant. Sungdong stood up, the movement so sudden and powerful that the heavy chair screeched against the floor. The directors scrambled to their feet, bowing their heads in shame. Get out, Sungdong said. It wasn't a shout. It was a death sentence. All of you. If I find out any of you were compensated to overlook this script, you won't live long enough to spend the money. Leave the tablet. The room cleared in seconds, the high-powered suits fleeing like mice. April remained in her chair, the adrenaline finally starting to ebb, leaving her feeling exposed. She looked up and found Sungdong standing right in front of her. He was too close, his dominant presence filling the space. You saved me twice in 6 hours, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate, terrifying low. I saved the company. April corrected, her pride flaring. I don't care about your mafia wars, Mr. Du. I care about the integrity of the work. You were being played for a fool. Sungdong reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he tucked a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. His touch was cold, but his eyes were burning. Most people who call me a fool don't live to finish the sentence. But you're the only person in this building who isn't afraid of me. Or maybe you're just too smart to realize how much trouble you're in. I know exactly how much trouble I'm in, April said, standing up to meet his gaze. She was smaller than him, but she didn't feel shorter. I'm the fiancé of a man who makes his living in shadows. I'm the target of a rival clan. And I'm currently the only thing standing between you and bankruptcy. Sungdong's hand dropped to her waist, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer. You're more than that, April. You're the Trojan horse I'm going to send back to them. They think I hired a cleaner. They have no idea I've found a queen. He turned toward the window, looking out over the Seoul skyline as if he already owned every inch of it. Prepare yourself. Tonight, we're not just going to dinner. We're going to war. And you're going to show the Bet clan exactly what happens when they try to steal from me. April looked at the tablet, then at the man who had effectively bought her life. She realized then that the boardroom wasn't a Shark Tank. It was a throne room, and she was no longer just cleaning the floors. Whatever happens tonight, April said, her voice hard as diamond, don't expect me to follow your script. I write my own code. Sungdong laughed, a short, dark sound that held no humor, only respect. I'm counting on it. As the sun set, casting the room into deep, bloody shadows, April realized the strategy session was over. The game, however, had only just begun. The atmosphere in the traditional tea house was a sharp, suffocating contrast to the cold glass of the Xinhua boardroom. Here, the air was thick with the scent of roasted barley and the unspoken weight of centuries of etiquette. April sat on the silk floor cushion, her back straight, her expression a mask of calm. Across from her sat Min Chai-rin, the woman Sungdong was supposed to marry, flanked by two elderly aunts who looked at April as if she were a stain on the pristine tatami mats. In our world, the tea ceremony is a test of character, Chai-rin said, her voice like honey poured over a blade. She lifted the ceramic pot with practiced, fluid grace. It requires patience, lineage, and an understanding of things that cannot be bought or coded. Chai-rin poured a cup, but instead of handing it to April, she set it just out of reach, her eyes tracing April's dark skin and natural hair with a patronizing smirk. I heard you were quite the hero in the boardroom, but solving a puzzle doesn't make you a lady. Tell me, April, in your village, did they even have tea? Or did you just drink from the well after a long day of sweeping? The ants chuckled behind their fans. It was a classic trap, a public humiliation designed to make April lose her temper and prove she didn't belong. April didn't take the bait. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes catching the amber light of the paper lanterns. In my home, we have a saying, the loudest bird has the thinnest feathers. You speak of lineage, Miss Min, but you're pouring the Huang Cha at 85 degrees Celsius. For this specific harvest, you should be at 72. You're scalding the leaves. Much like your conversation, it's bitter and lacks depth. Chai-rin's smirk faltered. The ants lowered their fans. As for my background, April continued, her voice gaining a rhythmic, commanding edge. I grew up in a world where we didn't have the luxury of pretending. If a system was broken, we fixed it. If a person was fake, we saw through them. You're hiding behind 1,000 years of tradition because you have nothing of your own to offer Sungdong. He doesn't need a doll to pour his tea. He needs a partner who can see the knife behind the smile. How dare you? Chai-rin hissed, her composure finally breaking. She reached for the teapot, her hand trembling with rage, intending to accidentally spill the scalding water toward April's lap. But April was faster. Her hand shot out, catching Chai-rin's wrist midair with a grip that was firm and undeniable. The room went silent. The tension was so thick it felt like the paper walls might burst. Careful, April whispered, her face inches from Chai-rin's. I spent 10 hours a day scrubbing floors. My hands are stronger than yours will ever be. If you drop that pot, the only person getting burned is you. At that moment, the sliding door at the end of the hall moved. Sungdong stepped in, his presence immediately pulling all the oxygen from the room. He took in the scene, the gripped wrist, the spilled tea, and the fire in April's eyes. Chai-rin immediately pulled back, her eyes welling with fake tears. Sungdong, your fiancée. She's physically threatening me. She has no respect for our customs. Sungdong walked over, but he didn't look at Chai-rin. He looked at the tea. He reached down, picked up April's cup, and took a sip. He winced slightly, setting it back down. She's right, Sungdong said coldly. The tea is burnt. And Chai-rin, if April wanted to hurt you, you wouldn't be standing. You'd be an entry in a ledger I'd have to close. He turned to April, extending a hand. We're leaving. My grandmother is waiting, and she's significantly less charming than Miss Min. As they walked out into the cool night air, the heavy scent of the tea house fading behind them, Sungdong didn't let go of her hand. You handled that well, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. Most people just cry when the Min family starts in on their heritage. I'm not most people, April replied, her heart still hammering against her ribs. And for the record, I actually hate that tea. It tastes like dirt. Sungdong let out a rare, low chuckle, the first time she had heard a sound from him that wasn't laced with a threat. Then it's a good thing I've already ordered the whiskey. Get in the car, April. The real vultures are waiting at the estate. April looked at the dark windows of the limousine. She had survived the office, the press, and the tea house. But as the car began to move toward the Du family mansion, she realized the face-slapping was over. Now, she was entering the lion's den. The transition from the tea house to the Du family estate felt like crossing a border into a different country, one where the laws of physics were replaced by the laws of power. The car ride was silent, the air between them thick with the residual heat of their shared defiance. Sungdong hadn't looked at April since they'd left, his gaze fixed on the passing city lights, his jaw a sharp, immovable line in the darkness. When the limousine finally pulled into the sprawling, heavily guarded compound, April felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and ancient secrets. Inside, the mansion was tomb quiet. Sungdong led her toward a private wing, his steps heavy. As they reached his personal quarters, he suddenly stumbled, his hand catching the doorframe with a muffled grunt. Mr. Du. April stepped forward, her instincts as a survivor overriding her caution. He didn't answer. He simply pushed through the door and collapsed into a leather armchair, his breathing shallow. The light in the room was dim, but it was enough for April to see the dark, wet stain spreading across the shoulder of his bespoke suit jacket. You're bleeding, she whispered, her voice tight. The gala, the assassination attempt. You were hit. It's a graze, Sungdong rasped, his eyes closed. Get the kit from the bathroom. Third drawer. April didn't argue. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent her life fixing things that others broke. When she returned, she found him struggling to pull off his jacket. She stepped in, her hands steady as she helped him peel away the layers of expensive wool and blood-soaked silk. As the shirt came off, the air left April's lungs. It wasn't just the fresh wound on his shoulder, a jagged, angry furrow from a high-caliber round. It was his back. Beneath the tailored suits and the Mafia Boss persona, Sungdong's skin was a map of old violence. Pale scars, some thin as threads, others thick and ropey, crisscrossed his shoulders and spine. Burn marks and blade tracks told a story of a childhood spent in the crosshairs and a climb to power that had cost him his very flesh. For the first time, April didn't see the monster of the Shinhwa group. She saw the boy who had survived the shadows. Stop staring, Sungdong muttered, though there was no bite in his voice. It isn't a museum. I'm not staring, April said softly, dipping a cloth into the antiseptic. I'm looking at the cost. She began to clean the wound. Sungdong winced, his muscles tensing under her touch, but he didn't pull away. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the silence of two strangers trapped in a contract. It was the heavy, fragile silence of two people who had both seen too much of the world's underside. My father gave me the one on the left, Sungdong said suddenly, his voice hollow. The day I turned 10, to remind me that trust is a luxury the Du family cannot afford. April paused, the damp cloth hovering over his skin. She thought of her own father, the man whose disappearance had led her to this country, to this uniform. She thought of the Gu family secrets she was still trying to untangle. My scars are on the inside, April whispered. But they're just as deep. Sungdong turned his head slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. The intense, hooded gaze was still there, but the ice had cracked. You aren't just a coder, are you, April? No ordinary person looks at a wound like this without trembling. I've spent my life cleaning up other people's messes, Mr. Du. Blood is just another stain if you know how to treat it. She finished bandaging his shoulder, her fingers lingering for a second too long on the warm skin of his arm. Sungdong reached up, his hand covering hers. This time, there were no cameras. No grandmother to impress. No rival to humiliate. His grip was firm, grounding her. Why are you really here, he asked. You could have taken the money and run. You're smart enough to disappear. April looked at the scars on his back, then into his eyes. Because the people who gave you those scars are the same ones who took everything from me. And I realized tonight, I'd rather be the shield for a man like you than a victim for a man like them. Sungdong's thumb traced the back of her hand, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a jolt of electricity through her. Then you'd better get some sleep, April. Because tomorrow, the shield becomes the sword. As she left his room, the image of his scarred back burned into her mind. April realized the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about a job or a fake marriage anymore. She had seen the man under the suit, and she knew that once you saw the truth in the shadows, there was no going back to the light. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Shinhwa Group headquarters was taut, like a wire about to snap. While the rest of the world saw a billionaire CEO and his mysterious fiancée, the financial markets saw blood in the water. By 9 a.m., a hostile takeover bid had been launched by a shadow conglomerate, moving with a speed that suggested they had been planning this strike for years. April sat in the war room, a high-tech nerve center hidden behind Sungdong's main office. The walls were covered in floor-to-ceiling digital displays tracking stock tickers, currency fluctuations, and aggressive buy orders. Sungdong stood in the center, his face a mask of cold fury as his top financial advisors shouted over one another. "They're buying up every floating share," one advisor yelled. "If they hit 51% by the closing bell, they can forcibly remove the board. Mr. Du, we're looking at a total loss of control." Sungdong didn't look at the advisor. He looked at April, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes fixed on a waterfall of raw data on a secondary monitor. "April, tell me you see something they don't." April didn't answer immediately. Her fingers were a blur as she typed, pulling up the proprietary algorithm the attackers were using to automate their buy orders. "They're using a pulse wave strategy," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "It's brilliant. It's designed to overwhelm your human traders by hitting the market in microsecond bursts." The lead advisor scoffed. "We know what it is, girl. We've tried to counterbid, but their capital seems bottomless." "It's not bottomless," April said, standing up and walking to the main glass display. She pointed to a specific recurring spike in the trade volume. "It's a loop. Look at the math. Every 1,000 trades, there's a microscopic delay, 0.004 seconds, where the algorithm verifies the last block of purchases." "So," the advisor snapped, "it's a standard verification lag." "No," April said, her voice growing sharp with the thrill of the hunt. "It's a mathematical flaw. They're using a Fibonacci-based scaling system to determine their bid price. It's supposed to make their moves unpredictable, but they've rounded the decimal point to the 5th digit to save processing power." She turned to Sungdong, her eyes bright with the hidden genius intensity he was beginning to crave. "Because they're rounding the math, there's a predictable ghost value being created in the bid-ask spread. If we flood the market with sell orders at exactly that ghost value during the 0.004 second lag, we won't just stop them. We'll trick their own algorithm into buying dead shares that don't exist." Sungdong stepped closer, the heat of his presence grounding her. "You're talking about a short squeeze on a microscopic scale. If you're wrong, we bankrupt ourselves in seconds." "I'm not wrong," April said, not blinking. "I wrote a similar defensive script back in university for a thesis on predatory algorithms. They think you're a mafia boss who only knows how to use a gun. They don't realize you have someone who knows how to break the house." Sungdong looked at the lead advisor, whose mouth was hanging open. "Do it," Sungdong commanded. "Give her full administrative access to the trade floor." For the next hour, the room was silent except for the frantic clicking of April's keyboard. She wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She was a conductor, orchestrating a financial massacre. Every time the shadow conglomerate moved to strike, April tripped their logic, forcing their own systems to cannibalize their capital. By 2 p.m., the ticker slowed. Then it plummeted. "They're retreating," the advisor screamed, his voice cracking. "They just lost $400 million in 20 minutes. The buy orders are canceling." The room erupted in cheers, but Sungdong only had eyes for April. She slumped back in her chair, her forehead beaded with sweat, the natural exhaustion of the mental marathon finally hitting her. Sungdong walked over and placed a hand on the back of her chair, his fingers brushing her shoulder. You didn't just save the company, April. You humiliated them. I told you, she whispered, looking up at him. I write my own code. I don't like being cheated. Sungdong leaned down, his face inches from hers. The tension in the room shifted from corporate to carnal. The Beck clan will know it was you. They'll realize you're the brain behind the shield. You've officially become the most dangerous person in this city. Then I guess it's a good thing I'm on your side, April replied, her heart racing for a very different reason now. Are you? Sungdong asked, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. The paperwork hasn't been filed, Sungdong. Chirin smirked, stepping closer until she was inches from April. And even if it were, a fake marriage for the sake of a visa is a felony. I've already contacted the dean of her university. Her scholarship? Revoked. Her status? Terminated. She isn't a queen. She's an illegal. The office staff began to whisper. The face slap Chirin was delivering was public and brutal. She wanted to strip April of her dignity before throwing her out of the country. April looked at the officers, then at the smirk on Chirin's face. The panic began to subside, replaced by the cold, calculating clarity that had saved Shinawa's millions hours earlier. She realized Chirin had made one fatal mistake. She assumed April was just a student. Wait, April said, stepping out from behind Sungdong. She looked at the officers. You're here because of the anonymous tip about my tier for visa, correct? That is correct, Miss Nakato, the lead officer replied. And you, Miss Min, April turned to Chirin, are so sure I'm a nobody that you didn't bother to check the Xinhua Group's global talent acquisition records from this morning. Chirin laughed. What records? You're a cleaner. I was a cleaner, April said, her voice rising with a rhythmic power that silenced the room. But as of 4 hours ago, after I stopped a $400 million hostile takeover, Mr. Du signed an one extraordinary ability petition. It was filed electronically via the Xinhua legal portal. It doesn't matter if my student visa is revoked. I am currently under an adjustment of status as a national asset. Sungdong caught on instantly. He didn't know if the paperwork was actually in the system yet, but he knew April was giving him the opening to make it real. Check the system again, officer, Sungdong commanded, his eyes boring into the man. You'll find that Miss Nakato is under the protection of the Xinhua Group's diplomatic legal tier. She isn't a student. She is a specialized consultant with a pending marriage to the CEO. The officer hesitated, tapping his tablet. April's fingers twitched. She had already sent a remote command from her smartwatch to the legal server's automated filing bot the moment the officers walked in. It was a 5-second hack that backdated the one application to 9 a.m. The officer's eyes widened. I see the filing here. Confirmed. one status pending. Spousal adjustment attached. Chirin's face turned a horrific shade of purple. That's impossible. She's lying. She's just a janitor. April walked right up to Chirin, mirroring the height of the woman who had tried to destroy her. You tried to use the law to fix your jealousy, Chirin. But you forgot. I'm the one who understands how systems work. You play with tea and tradition. I play with reality. April leaned in, whispering so only Chirin could hear. If you ever try to touch my status again, I won't just stay in this country. I'll make sure your family's political connections are investigated for the tip you just gave. I wonder what the tax authorities will find in the Min family ledgers once I start digging. Chirin backed away, her hands shaking. She looked at Sungdong, looking for a shred of pity, but found only the cold, jagged edge of his satisfaction. Leave, Sungdong said, the word dropping like a guillotine. The officers apologized and ushered a fuming Chirin out of the office. The staff went back to their desks in a stunned silence. April stood in the center of the room, the adrenaline finally leaving her. Sungdong walked over to her. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer a hug. He reached out and tilted her chin up so she had to look at him. You backdated that filing in front of federal officers, he whispered, his eyes dark with a mix of danger and desire. That's a 20-year sentence if they catch you. They won't, April said, her voice steady. My code is perfect. I'm starting to believe that, Sungdong said. He let go of her chin and straightened his coat. But Chirin was right about one thing. The wedding can't be a show anymore. We're going to the cathedral. Tomorrow. If we're going to lie to the world, we're going to do it so well that even the devil believes us. April looked at the man who was now her only protection and her greatest captor. Tomorrow, then. But Mr. Du? Don't forget who's really running the system. Sungdong didn't reply. He just turned toward the window, the sunset casting him in a blood-red glow. The cathedral was a monument to cold stone and ancient power, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that even the 1,000 flickering candles couldn't reach. April felt like a ghost in her own body. She was draped in a wedding gown of ivory lace that cost more than her father's entire house, her dark skin glowing against the delicate fabric. But beneath the tulle and silk, her heart was a drum of war. Sungdong stood at the altar, a vision of lethal elegance in a midnight black tuxedo. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a king preparing for a conquest. As April walked down the aisle, the silence of the invited guests, a mix of high society vultures and stony-faced underworld lieutenants, was heavier than the cathedral's bells. The ceremony was a blur of Latin and lies. When Sungdong slipped the diamond band onto her finger, his touch was steady, but his eyes were scanning the perimeter of the room. He knew. He had the same premonition April had. The Beck clan wouldn't let this union happen. The explosion didn't come from a bomb. It came from the stained glass windows. The magnificent depictions of saints shattered inward in a rain of colorful glass. Armed men in tactical gear swung from ropes, their boots hitting the stone floor with a synchronized thud. The guests screamed, diving under pews as the first volley of gunfire echoed through the nave. Down, Sungdong roared, throwing his body over April's just as a bullet whizzed through the space where her head had been a second before. He pulled a sleek, matte black handgun from an ankle holster hidden beneath his trousers. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, dropping an assassin near the pulpit. But they were surrounded. His own security team was pinned down at the entrance. Stay behind the altar, Sungdong commanded, his voice raw. He moved with a brutal, feline grace, using the heavy stone structure as cover while he returned fire. April pressed her back against the cold marble, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at the chaos, the blood on the white lilies, the screaming socialites, the calculated movements of the Beck clan. Her survival instinct, honed by years of being the invisible cleaner, suddenly shifted into high gear. She noticed something the gunman didn't. 2 of the assassins were positioning themselves on the choir loft directly above Sungdong. They weren't aiming for the guards. They were aiming for him. Sungdong, 12 o'clock high, she screamed. He glanced up, rolling to the side just as the loft ignited with muzzle flashes. Stone chips sprayed his face. He was trapped. To hit them, he had to expose himself to the gunman on the floor. April realized that if she didn't act, her fake marriage was going to end in a very real funeral. She scanned the altar. Beside her was the heavy, ornate silver candelabra, still holding a dozen lit tapers. Beyond it, the massive velvet curtain that draped the back of the chancel. She didn't think. She grabbed the candelabra, ignoring the hot wax that scalded her hands, and hurled it with every ounce of strength into the heavy velvet. The fabric, dry and aged, caught fire instantly. A wall of flame and thick, black smoke erupted between the choir loft and the altar. The assassins above lost their line of sight. They coughed, blinded by the sudden inferno. Now, April yelled. Sungdong used the distraction to lunge forward, taking out the floor-level gunman with cold, surgical precision. He reached the base of the loft stairs, throwing a flashbang grenade he'd taken from a downed guard. The explosion of light and sound paralyzed the remaining attackers. Within minutes, the Xinhua reinforcements broke through the main doors. The cathedral was secured, leaving only the smell of gunpowder and burning velvet. Sungdong stood in the middle of the wreckage, his shirt torn, his face streaked with soot. He looked at April. She was standing by the smoldering altar, Her white dress scorched at the hem, her hands red from the hot wax, holding a shard of glass she'd picked up as a last resort weapon. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the remnants of the windows. He didn't say a word. He reached out and pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, crushing intensity that had nothing to do with the contract. "You could have stayed down," he whispered into her hair, his heart racing against her chest. "Why did you do that?" April pulled back just enough to look at him, her wide eyes defiant even in the aftermath of death. "I told you, Mr. Du. I'm the shield, and nobody breaks my system." Sungdong looked at her, really looked at her, and the last of the icy walls in his gaze crumbled. He realized then that he hadn't just found a strategist or a coder. He had found the only person in the world who would bleed for him. "The wedding is over," Sungdong said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. "But our war? Our war has just become personal." He turned to his lead guard. "Clean this up, and find out who leaked the cathedral's structural plans. I want their heads by midnight." As he led April out of the smoking ruins, her hand firmly in his, April realized she was no longer a cleaner or an illegal student. She was the woman who had saved the King of Seoul, and the world was about to find out exactly how deadly that made her. The heavy, iron-bound doors of Sungdong's private study clicked shut, sealing out the echoes of the cathedral's sirens and the frantic whispers of the Xinhua guards. Inside, the only light came from the glowing monitors and a single lamp that cast Sungdong's shadow across the wall like a giant. April stood by the desk, her fingers trembling as she pulled a small, battered silver locket from beneath the lace of her wedding dress. She hadn't shown it to anyone since arriving in Seoul, not even the immigration officers. "You didn't save me tonight because you're a hero, April," Sungdong said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He was leaning against the window, watching the rain wash the soot from the glass. "And you didn't hack my servers just to save my money. You're looking for something. Or someone." April flipped the locket open. Inside was a grainy photograph of a man in a Xinhua technician's uniform, standing next to a younger, more smiling version of Du Sungdong's own father. "My father was an engineer for Xinhua overseas," April said, her voice cracking for the first time. 10 years ago, he sent a final encrypted message saying he'd found a glitch in the company's logistics. Then he vanished. The official report said it was an industrial accident in a Lagos port, but the manifest was wiped. No body, no record, just a hush money check sent to my mother that she was too proud to touch. She looked at Sungdong, her eyes burning with a decade of grief. "I didn't come here to be a cleaner. I used the janitorial job to get physical access to the legacy servers, the ones not connected to the cloud. I thought if I could find the original manifest, I'd find out who murdered him." Sungdong walked over to her, his gaze falling on the photo in the locket. His expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. He reached out, his thumb tracing the image of his father. "My father didn't have friends, April," Sungdong whispered. "He had assets. But I remember this man. He was the only one who didn't bow when my father entered a room. He used to call the logistics glitch by a different name. He called it the Shadow Ledger." He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keys with a redirected fury. "The Shadow Ledger was a backdoor my father used to move untraceable capital between the Xinhua group and the Baek clan. It was the foundation of the peace treaty between the families. If your father found it, he wasn't an accident. He was a loose end." April felt the air leave her lungs. "So your family, your father, ordered the hit." Sungdong looked at her, the cold light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes. "My father is dead, April. But the man who ran the logistics division back then? The man who signed the accident report?" He hit a final key, and a document appeared on the screen. It was an old personnel file. At the bottom was a digital signature that made April's blood run cold. Min Sangho, the patriarch of the Min family. Chiron's father. "The Mints didn't just want a marriage for status," Sungdong said, his voice dropping to a lethal growl. "They wanted the marriage to bury the ledger forever. They knew that if I ever dug too deep, I'd find what they did to the Xinhua engineers who wouldn't take the bribe." April gripped the edge of the desk. The mystery was no longer a ghost story. It was a roadmap. Her father hadn't just disappeared. He had been sacrificed to keep a mafia alliance alive. They think I'm just a girl from a village, April said, her voice turning to ice. They think they can deport me or humiliate me. But I have the decryption skills my father taught me, and now I have the names. She looked at Sungdong, the fake husband who was now her only link to the truth. You said tonight was personal. You have no idea. Sungdong reached out, taking her hand. His grip wasn't a claim this time. It was a pact. The Beck clan tried to kill us at the altar to protect this secret. The mints tried to deport you to hide it. We aren't just partners in a company anymore, April. We're the ones who are going to burn the ledger down. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers in the dark study. Tell me, Queen of the Underworld, how do we start? April looked at the screen, a dark, brilliant smirk forming on her lips. We don't go after their money. We go after their history. I'm going to leak the shadow ledger to every tax authority in the Greater China region. But first, I'm going to make sure Min Sang-ho watches his empire crumble from the inside out. The cleaning girl was gone. The fiancé was a mask. In the heart of the Xinhua Tower, a new power had been born, one that used code as a bayonet and truth as a bomb. The digital screen in the Xinhua boardroom didn't show stock prices or corporate logos. It showed the systematic annihilation of the Min family's legacy. April sat at the head of the long table, the same seat once occupied by the directors who had called her a nobody. Next to her, Sungdong watched the data streams with a silent, predatory intensity. Together, they had spent the last 48 hours leaking the shadow ledger, not to the press, where it could be buried, but to the international forensic auditors who couldn't be bought. It's done, April said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of 10 years of searching. The Hanshin merger has officially inverted. The Min family assets are being seized as we speak. By tomorrow, Min Sang-ho won't even own the chair he's sitting in. The heavy doors to the boardroom burst open. Min Sang-ho staggered in, flanked by a few remaining guards. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in a single night. He ignored Sungdong and pointed a shaking finger at April. You brat. You think you can just waltz into our world and tear down what it took decades to build? Your father was a bug under my boot, and you should have stayed in the dirt with him. April stood up. She didn't look angry. She looked like a judge. My father didn't build his world on corpses and shadow ledgers, Mr. Min. He built it on integrity. You didn't kill him because he was a bug. You killed him because he was a mirror, and you couldn't stand what you saw in yourself. Sungdong stood beside her, his hand resting on the back of her chair, a clear signal to the guards that any move against her was a move against the entire Xinhua Empire. The police are in the lobby, Sang-ho. The Beck clan has already cut ties to save their own skins. You have no allies left. As the authorities entered to lead the broken patriarch away, the boardroom fell into a profound, ringing silence. The traitors had been purged, the debts paid, and the Gu family, mystery finally laid to rest with the truth. Sungdong turned to April. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he finally traced the line of her jaw. There was no coldness left in his eyes, only a deep, scorched respect. The company is stable. The enemies are gone. The contract is technically fulfilled, Sungdong said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous velvet. You can take the settlement I promised and go anywhere in the world. You're free, April. April looked at the massive windows overlooking Seoul, the city that had tried to crush her, only to find she was made of diamond. She looked at the ring on her finger, then back at the man who had seen the queen beneath the maid uniform. I've spent 10 years running from the past, trying to find a way back home, April said softly. But I realized something while we were writing that code. Home isn't a place you go back to. It's the place you build with the person who actually sees you. She stepped closer, closing the final inch of space between them. The contract might be over, Du Sungdong, but I'm not done with you yet. Sungdong smiled, a genuine, rare expression that transformed his sharp features. He pulled her into a kiss that wasn't for the cameras, wasn't for the media, and wasn't for his grandmother. It was a kiss of equals, a pact between the king of the underground and the woman who had conquered his world with a mop and a keyboard. Then let's start the new empire, Sungdong whispered against her lips. And this time, we write the rules. April looked out at the sunrise hitting the Shinhwa Tower. The cleaning girl was gone. The fake fiancé was dead. In their place stood a legend.